Picture this: a battlefield where victory didn't always belong to the strongest or the most heavily armored, but to the cunning, the creative, and the utterly unpredictable. For centuries, warfare wasn't just about clashing swords or overwhelming numbers. It was a deadly chess match where deception, psychology, and sheer ingenuity decided the fate of empires. Yet somewhere along the way, the most brilliant tactics of the medieval world vanished, erased from history, buried by time, or deliberately scrubbed from the records. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 25 of these forgotten battle strategies, the kind that turned the tide of wars with nothing but cleverness and nerve. Think about the last time you read about a famous medieval battle. Chances are it focused on heroic charges or epic last stands. But what if I told you that some of the most decisive moments in history weren't won by strength alone, but by feigned retreats that lured enemies into slaughter, by armies that weaponized the very terrain beneath their feet, or by commanders who spread rumors so convincing they shattered enemy morale before the first arrow was even loosed? These weren't just tricks, they were masterstrokes of strategy honed over generations and then lost to time. Some were deemed too dishonorable, others too unpredictable, and many were simply too effective, so much so that rivals made sure they were forgotten. This isn't just a journey through battles, it's a rediscovery of a lost art. We'll see how night raids turned darkness into an ally, how hollow logs mimicked the roar of cannons to terrify foes, and how mounted archers perfected the art of firing backward while retreating, a move so devastating it crushed entire legions. We'll uncover why these tactics disappeared, how their absence changed warfare forever, and what we can learn from them today. Because the truth is, the past wasn't just blood and chaos, it was a laboratory of human creativity, where the stakes were life and death, and the solutions were nothing short of genius. So, ready to step onto the battlefield and see history in a whole new light? Let's begin. Few tactics in history were as brutally effective or as psychologically devastating as the feigned retreat. Imagine watching the enemy army suddenly break ranks, fleeing in what seems like panic and disarray. Victory seems within your grasp, so you order a full pursuit, only to realize too late that you've just marched your men straight into a slaughter. This wasn't just a trick, it was a masterclass in deception, and no one wielded it more lethally than the Mongols. At the Battle of Kalka River in 1223, they turned this tactic into an art form. Outnumbered and facing a coalition of Russian and Cuman forces, the Mongols appeared to crumble under pressure, their cavalry scattering in retreat. The enemy, smelling blood, gave chase, only to find themselves encircled, exhausted, and cut off from reinforcements. What followed was a massacre so complete it reshaped the balance of power in Eastern Europe. But the feigned retreat wasn't just about deception, it preyed on human nature itself. The thrill of chasing a fleeing enemy clouded judgment, making disciplined armies abandon caution in favor of reckless pursuit. The Mongols understood this better than anyone. Their horsemen, trained from childhood to maneuver with precision, could feign chaos while maintaining perfect control. They'd retreat for miles, stretching enemy lines thin, before wheeling around to attack from all sides. It wasn't just a tactic, it was a psychological weapon, turning an opponent's confidence into their downfall. By the Renaissance, though, this brilliant maneuver had all but vanished from the battlefield. Why? The rise of professional standing armies and rigid pike and shot formations prized order over flexibility. Commanders began to see unpredictability as a liability, not an asset. Battles became chess matches played on open fields where discipline and firepower decided the day. The feigned retreat, with its inherent risk of genuine collapse if poorly executed, fell out of favor. But something vital was lost in that shift: the element of surprise, the ability to turn an enemy's strength against them. Modern warfare, for all its technology, rarely captures the sheer audacity of those medieval gambits. What's fascinating is how this tactic echoes in unexpected places. Even today, special forces units study these ancient ruses, proving that sometimes the oldest tricks are the hardest to see coming. Terrain wasn't just the stage for medieval battles, it was a weapon in the hands of brilliant commanders. While modern generals rely on satellites and drones, their medieval counterparts mastered the art of turning forests, rivers, and even weather into decisive advantages. Picture the muddy fields of Agincourt in 1415, where a combination of careful positioning and torrential rain transformed the landscape into a death trap for French knights. Their heavy armor, formidable on solid ground, became a liability as horses sank belly deep into the muck, turning what should have been a crushing charge into a slow-motion slaughter for English longbowmen. This wasn't luck, it was calculated terrain manipulation at its finest. But Agincourt was just one example of this forgotten art. Across Europe and Asia, innovative leaders exploited natural features with ruthless efficiency. Byzantine generals deliberately lured enemies into narrow mountain passes where their numbers meant nothing. Scottish Highlanders used dense thickets to neutralize English cavalry, while Mongol scouts mapped every swamp and salt flat to ensure their enemies fought where movement was impossible. Some commanders even engineered the battlefield itself, flooding plains by diverting rivers or setting controlled fires to steer opponents into ambushes. At the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, Swiss rebels rolled boulders down slopes onto Austrian knights, proving hills could be as deadly as any sword. What makes these tactics so fascinating is their sheer adaptability. Unlike standardized formations or weaponry, terrain warfare demanded intimate knowledge of local conditions and quick thinking. A commander couldn't just memorize a playbook, they had to read the land like a living map, spotting opportunities invisible to the untrained eye. The Welsh longbowmen who used dense forests for cover, the Arab armies that vanished into desert mirages, the Vietnamese who turned rice paddies into impassable barriers, all understood that nature could be the greatest ally. Yet by the 18th century, this mastery of environment began fading from military doctrine. The rise of gunpowder and industrialized warfare created an illusion that technology could overcome any obstacle. Why study wind patterns when cannons could blast through walls? Why worry about mud when tanks could roll over it? But this shift came at a cost. Modern armies often found themselves baffled when technology failed, like Napoleon's artillery bogging down in Russian snow or American tanks immobilized in Iraqi sandstorms. The old masters would have seen these coming. Perhaps the most striking legacy of terrain tactics is how they're being rediscovered today. Special forces study medieval battles to understand guerrilla warfare, while survival manuals revive ancient knowledge about navigating hostile landscapes. There's poetic justice in the fact that after centuries of dismissing these methods as primitive, we're finally recognizing their sophistication. Because in the end, the land doesn't care about your weapons or your rank. It only responds to those who learn its language. Darkness was more than just the absence of light. It was a weapon, meticulously wielded by commanders who understood that fear thrives in the unknown. Long before modern special forces equipped themselves with night vision technology, medieval armies turned the cover of night into a strategic advantage. The Byzantines, masters of psychological warfare, didn't just attack under the cloak of darkness, they weaponized it. Their nocturnal assaults weren't mere surprises. They were orchestrated chaos designed to amplify confusion and paralyze enemies with dread. Picture defenders straining their eyes against the blackness, hearts pounding at every rustle, only to be suddenly engulfed by a wave of attackers who seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves. One of the most chilling examples unfolded during the Siege of Crema in 1260. The defending forces, confident behind their walls, were unprepared for the Byzantine innovation of torchlight tactics. Attackers carried flickering torches not just to see, but to blind, swinging them in erratic patterns to disorient defenders, turning the night into a disorienting maze of light and shadow. The effect was devastating. Archers couldn't aim, sentries couldn't signal, and by the time the defenders realized the torches were a distraction, it was too late. The real assault had already breached their weakest points. What made night raids so potent wasn't just the element of surprise, but the psychological toll they exacted. Sleep deprivation, heightened paranoia, and the sheer unpredictability of a foe who refused to fight by daylight could unravel even disciplined armies. The Mongols took this further, timing their attacks in the dead of night to exploit the groggy disorientation of waking soldiers. Meanwhile, Islamic forces during the Crusades used silent approaches, wrapping hooves in cloth, muffling armor, to strike without warning, leaving enemies to wonder if the attack had come from man or specter. Yet by the 18th century, nighttime assaults had largely vanished from conventional warfare. The rise of gunpowder and massed formations made such operations riskier. Coordinating large units in darkness became a logistical nightmare. But the deeper reason was a shift in military philosophy. Enlightenment-era commanders prized order and control, viewing the chaos of night fighting as barbaric or undisciplined. The very unpredictability that once made these tactics so effective now rendered them taboo. It's ironic that modern militaries have circled back to these ancient principles. Special forces today train extensively in night operations, not just for stealth, but to exploit the same psychological edge medieval warriors understood instinctively. Darkness, it turns out, is timeless, and while we've replaced torches with infrared scopes, the essence remains the same. The night belongs not to the strongest, but to those who dare to master its shadows. Long before the term fake news entered modern vocabulary, medieval generals were already masters of misinformation, weaving lies so convincing they could topple cities without firing a single arrow. Deception wasn't just a tactic, it was an art form where rumors held more power than swords, and illusions could decide the fate of kingdoms. Take the siege of Constantinople in 1453, where the outnumbered Byzantines faced the Ottomans' terrifying new weapon, massive cannons capable of smashing through walls. But the defenders had a trick of their own. By rolling hollow logs down stone staircases, they created an echoing thunder identical to incoming artillery fire. The Ottomans, convinced their enemies had matching firepower, delayed their assault, buying precious days for the city. This wasn't an isolated stunt. Across the medieval world, commanders manipulated perceptions with theatrical precision. The Mongols tied branches to their horses' tails, kicking up dust clouds to simulate endless reinforcements. During the Crusades, Richard the Lionheart spread rumors of his own death, only to resurrect dramatically at the perfect moment, shattering enemy morale. Some armies even staged elaborate fake defections, sending deserters to feed false battle plans to the enemy. The psychological impact was devastating after all. How do you strategize when you can't trust your own eyes and ears? What made these deceptions so effective was their understanding of human psychology. People crave patterns, so medieval tacticians gave them false ones to follow. A general might order campfires lit far beyond his actual troop count, knowing scouts would report an overwhelming force. Others dressed peasants as knights during parleys, making their army appear lavishly equipped. The goal was never just to mislead, it was to implant doubt so deep that enemies second-guessed every decision. Yet by the 17th century, these tactics began fading from European warfare. The rise of chivalric codes and Enlightenment ideals branded deception as dishonorable, even cowardly. Battles became theatrical performances of honest combat, where lining up in neat rows and firing on command was seen as morally superior to cunning. The irony, while Western armies abandoned these methods, Asian and Middle Eastern commanders continued using them to great effect. The Ottomans, for instance, maintained elaborate deception divisions well into the 19th century. The real cost of this shift wasn't just the loss of clever tricks, it was the narrowing of warfare's creative potential. Modern militaries would spend centuries relearning what medieval generals knew instinctively. That information is a battlefield, and controlling it can be more decisive than any weapon. Today's cyber warfare and psychological operations owe more to those hollow logs at Constantinople than we might realize, because in the end, the best lies aren't just falsehoods. They're stories so compelling, even reality bends to fit them. Few maneuvers in military history combined elegance and lethality quite like the Parthian shot, a tactic so fluid it turned retreat into annihilation. Picture this: horsemen galloping away as if in full flight, their bodies twisted backward, bows drawn with lethal precision. Just as pursuing enemies thought victory was within reach, arrows rained down upon them with terrifying accuracy. The Parthians, nomadic warriors of the ancient Near East, didn't just master this move, they weaponized the illusion of defeat itself. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, they turned it against Rome's vaunted legions, luring Crassus's overconfident forces deep into the desert before unleashing volleys of arrows from impossible angles. The result, one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history, with 20,000 soldiers dead and their famed standards captured. What made the Parthian shot so revolutionary wasn't just the technical skill it required, though firing accurately at a full gallop backward demanded years of training, but its psychological brilliance. It exploited the natural impulse to chase a fleeing enemy, transforming pursuit into a death trap. The Parthians' composite bows, with their superior range and penetrating power, allowed them to strike from distances where Roman javelins were useless. And because their horses were lighter and faster, they could maintain this deadly dance indefinitely, bleeding their opponents dry without ever engaging in close combat. It was warfare as performance art, with every feigned retreat a prelude to slaughter. Yet by the Middle Ages, this tactic had all but disappeared from the battlefield. The rise of heavily armored knights and shock cavalry prioritized brute force over flexibility. Plate armor could deflect arrows, and mass charges rendered hit and run tactics obsolete. But the deeper reason for its decline was a shift in military philosophy. As warfare became more institutionalized, specialization replaced versatility. Knights trained for lance charges, infantry drilled in shield walls, and the idea of a single warrior skilled in both mounted and ranged combat faded. The Parthian shot didn't just vanish, it was engineered out of existence by an era that valued raw power over cunning. The irony: modern militaries have spent decades trying to replicate the Parthian shot's principles in new forms. Helicopter gunships use similar shoot and scoot tactics, striking from a distance before retreating to safety. Drone warfare, with its emphasis on precision strikes from unseen angles, echoes the same logic. Even in sports, athletes like basketball players master the fadeaway shot, a distant cousin of the Parthian technique. The lesson is timeless. Sometimes, the most devastating blows come not from facing your enemy head-on, but from striking while seeming to yield. Now imagine a weapon even more unpredictable than arrows fired backward, one that could turn the very skies against an enemy. Because next, we'll see how medieval commanders didn't just fight in bad weather, they orchestrated it. Weather wasn't just a condition medieval armies endured. It was a weapon sharpened by cunning commanders who understood how to turn raindrops into arrows and fog into shields. While modern generals check satellite forecasts, their medieval counterparts read the skies like a battle manual, timing campaigns around harvest rains or waiting for winter's bite to transform marshes into frozen highways. At the Battle of Muhlberg in 1547, Spanish forces under Charles V demonstrated this mastery perfectly. As dawn broke, they deliberately waited for the Elbe River's notorious fog to roll in, masking their crossing until the last possible moment. Protestant rebels, blinded by the mist, barely had time to form ranks before Habsburg cavalry was upon them. The victory wasn't just tactical, it was meteorological. But fog was merely one tool in this forgotten arsenal. Scandinavian warlords timed raids for autumn storms when enemy ships were least likely to patrol. Mongol scouts memorized seasonal wind patterns to ensure their arrows always flew with the gale at their backs. Perhaps most ingeniously, Russian commanders during the Northern Crusades would flood fields before battles, forcing Teutonic knights to charge through knee-deep water that neutralized their heavy cavalry's greatest strength speed. Even frost became an ally. The Livonian Brotherhood famously sprayed water over castle approaches in winter, creating ice sheets that made scaling ladders impossible. These weren't lucky accidents, they were calculated manipulations of nature itself. The true brilliance of weather warfare lay in its regional specificity. Islamic armies in the Levant learned to fight sandstorms by tying ropes between horses to maintain formations. Meanwhile, Alpine militias trained to trigger controlled avalanches, burying invaders under walls of snow. This hyperlocal knowledge gave smaller forces an edge against larger empires until warfare's globalization erased it. As European powers expanded overseas, they brought rigid tactics developed for temperate climates to monsoonal jungles and arid deserts with disastrous results. Napoleon's troops froze in Russia without proper winter gear, while British redcoats in India wilted under heat, their wool uniforms trapped mercilessly. What modern militaries eventually rediscovered, often painfully, was that weather doesn't negotiate. Today's special forces study medieval battles to understand monsoon fighting in Southeast Asia or sandstorm navigation in the Middle East. There's poetic justice in seeing 21st century soldiers relearn what 14th century sergeants knew instinctively, that the greatest general of all might just be the sky itself. Now prepare to hear the most unsettling weapon of all, one that required no steel, no fire, just the raw power of human voices raised in terror. Because next, we'll uncover how screams could shatter armies before the first blade was drawn. Before the first sword ever clashed in battle, sound was already winning wars. Imagine standing in a medieval shield wall when suddenly, the air splits with a chorus of screams so unnatural, your blood turns to ice. This was psychological screamery, a weaponized symphony of terror designed to shatter nerves before blades even met. The Swiss perfected this art with their famed bull roarers, wooden instruments that spun on cords to produce a shrieking wail resembling damned souls. At the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, these unholy sounds echoed through Alpine valleys, causing Austrian knights' horses to panic and throw riders into the mud where rebel halberds finished them. But screams weren't the only tools in this acoustic arsenal. Norse berserkers chanted guttural war songs to induce trance-like fury, while Tibetan monks used meter-long Dungeon horns to project bass notes that vibrated enemy armor. The Aztecs took it further, attaching whistles to arrows so they screamed mid-flight, a sonic bombardment that made death itself audible. These weren't mere noises, they were precision strikes against human psychology. Studies now show certain frequencies trigger primal fear responses, explaining why the Maori's haka dance still unsettles modern athletes. Medieval commanders intuitively exploited this, turning battlefields into theaters of sound where the real fight was for control of an enemy's mind. What's startling is how scientific these methods were. Byzantine manuals detail specific horn blast sequences to signal different false retreats, while Mongol drummers used arrhythmic patterns to induce disorientation. The Florentine army even employed professional noisemakers, whose sole job was clanging pots during night raids to magnify confusion. This wasn't chaos, it was acoustic engineering centuries before decibel meters existed. Yet by the Napoleonic era, organized screaming fell from favor. Standardized drum cadences and bugle calls prioritized order over terror, valuing coordination above psychological disruption. The irony, modern militaries now invest millions in sound cannons for crowd control, while special forces study these ancient scream tactics for urban warfare. The Swiss, it seems, were onto something their enemies couldn't outrun because fear's echo lingers long after the last scream fades. Now, consider a weapon far older than any horn or drum, one with claws, fangs, and instincts honed over millennia. Because next, we'll reveal how animals became medieval warfare's most unpredictable allies. Animals weren't just companions in medieval warfare, they were living weapons, each species deployed with chilling creativity to exploit an enemy's weakest point. Take the Mongols' legendary horses, armored not in steel but in silk. By dressing their mounts in this unexpected material, Genghis Khan's cavalry gained a bizarre advantage. Arrow impacts would drive silk fibers into wounds, preventing fatal bleeding while allowing horses to keep charging. These nimble steeds could travel 80 kilometers a day, outlasting heavier European warhorses that collapsed under their own armor. But silk-clad horses were just the beginning of this bestiary of war. Few sights were as horrifying or as effective as the ancient tactic of flaming pigs. Roman historians recorded besiegers coating swine in tar, igniting them, and driving the shrieking animals toward enemy lines. The chaos was unimaginable. Burning pigs couldn't be stopped by shields, their panicked squeals terrified war elephants, and their scorched flesh carried disease. At the siege of Megara in 266 BC, these living torches reportedly caused an entire phalanx to break formation and flee. Meanwhile, ravens served as medieval drones. The Norse used them to scout enemy camps, while Saladin's forces tied incendiary messages to their legs to burn crops. Even bees became weapons. Welsh castles kept hives to hurl at invaders, turning nature's pollinators into airborne agony. The sheer variety of animal tactics reveals how deeply commanders understood both biology and psychology. Camels weren't just desert transports, their unfamiliar scent spooked European horses. Dogs wore spiked collars to gut the bellies of charging cavalry. And in one of history's most bizarre sieges, the Byzantines allegedly unleashed cages of starving lions outside city gates, not to attack but to demoralize defenders with their endless roars. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were calculated applications of zoological knowledge we're only now rediscovering. Modern studies confirm that certain animal sounds trigger primal fear, responses something medieval warriors exploited instinctively. What ultimately doomed these methods wasn't morality but machinery. The Industrial Revolution made animals seem inefficient compared to steam power and gunpowder. Yet in abandoning them, warfare lost something irreplaceable, the element of unpredictability. A tank can't improvise like a panicked bull, nor can a radio mimic the terror of 1,000 shrieking bats unleashed in a cavernous castle. Today's militaries are ironically circling back to animal analogues, with drone swarms modeled after bee colonies and robotic pack mules based on goat agility. The Mongols would likely nod in recognition after all. They knew the best weapons aren't always the loudest, but the ones an enemy never sees coming. Now picture a siege where the real weapon wasn't catapults or battering rams, but something far quieter, the slow, inevitable creep of hunger, because next we'll see how patience could crumble walls faster than any cannon. Silent sieges were warfare's slowest, most merciless chess move, a game where victory came not from clashing steel, but from watching an enemy wither under the invisible weight of hunger and thirst. While Hollywood loves dramatic assaults on castle walls, the truth is many medieval strongholds fell without a single ladder touching stone. The Teutonic Knights demonstrated this chilling efficiency at Marienburg in 1454. Facing rebellious Prussian towns, they didn't bother storming the gates. Instead, they encircled the city, severed every supply route, and waited. Weeks turned to months as desperation set in. Rats became a luxury, then a memory. By the time defenders surrendered, they were too weak to lift their weapons. This wasn't just strategy, it was psychological torture disguised as patience. What made silent sieges so devastating was their inevitability. Unlike a battering ram that might fail, starvation never did. Byzantine manuals advised poisoning wells with animal carcasses to hasten the process, while Arab tacticians diverted entire rivers to leave enemies parched. The Welsh took it further. During Edward I's conquest, they'd secretly contaminate grain stores with ergot fungus, causing hallucinations among besieged English troops. But the real genius lay in the waiting game's secondary effects. As supplies dwindled, discipline crumbled, loyalty was sold for crusts of bread, and commanders faced mutiny long before the walls were breached. At the Siege of Jerusalem in 1199, Crusaders reported defenders eating leather belts while their leaders debated surrender, proof that hunger could break even the holiest resolve. The decline of silent sieges mirrors a broader shift in military priorities. With the advent of gunpowder artillery in the 15th century, why wait months when cannons could smash walls in days? But something profound was lost in that transition, the art of outthinking rather than outgunning an opponent. Modern militaries rediscovered this during World War II's sieges of Leningrad and Malta, where blockade tactics eerily echoed medieval methods. Even today, economic sanctions operate on the same principle: starve, isolate, and let time do the work. Now imagine flipping the script entirely. Not just waiting outside enemy walls, but slipping right through them. Because next, we'll explore how disguises turned ordinary soldiers into masters of infiltration, proving sometimes the best armor was no armor at all. Disguises turned medieval warfare into a deadly masquerade where the most effective soldiers weren't always the ones in shining armor. Sometimes they were the ones dressed as merchants, pilgrims, or even enemy troops. The Trojan horse tactic wasn't just a myth from antiquity. It was a living, breathing strategy that decided sieges and toppled kingdoms. During the Reconquista, Christian knights pulled off one of history's most audacious infiltrations by donning Moorish robes and turbans. Blending seamlessly into the bustling markets of Cordoba, they waited for the perfect moment to strike, throwing open the city gates under cover of darkness, allowing their armies to flood in unchallenged. This wasn't just deception, it was theater where costumes became weapons and trust was the ultimate vulnerability. The brilliance of these ruses lay in their psychological precision. Medieval societies relied heavily on visual cues, uniforms, heraldry, even accents, to distinguish friend from foe. A group of merchants with the right attire and mannerisms could stroll past guards who'd never think to check their cargo for hidden weapons. The Byzantines elevated this art to near science, training agents to mimic enemy dialects flawlessly. At the siege of Antioch in 1098, Crusaders exploited this by having a Turkish-speaking soldier convince defenders to lower a bridge, sealing the city's fate. These weren't lone wolves acting on impulse. They were calculated operations that exploited the human tendency to see what they expected to see. But the golden age of disguised tactics crumbled under the weight of modernization. By the 17th century, European armies began standardizing uniforms not just for cohesion, but to eliminate the ambiguity infiltrators thrived on. Suddenly, a soldier's allegiance was stitched into his coat in bright, unmistakable colors. The rise of professional espionage units also meant fewer opportunities for improvisational trickery. Yet the legacy of these tactics lingers in unexpected places. Modern special forces still study medieval infiltration methods, proving that sometimes the oldest tricks are the hardest to spot, especially when they're hiding in plain sight. Now consider an even darker twist on deception, not just impersonating the enemy, but earning their trust only to shatter it from within. Because next, we'll reveal how false allies orchestrated betrayals so devastating, they rewrote the outcomes of entire wars. Nothing shattered an enemy's resolve faster than betrayal from within, especially when it came from those they trusted most. The tactic of false allies was medieval warfare's ultimate psychological gut punch, turning brotherhood into a weapon and trust into a fatal weakness. Take the Varangian Guard, those legendary Norse mercenaries who served as the Byzantine emperor's elite protectors. At the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081, they demonstrated why loyalty was often just a bargaining chip. Midway through the clash, these sworn defenders abruptly switched sides, swinging their dreaded axes not for the Byzantines but against them. The shock was so complete, the entire imperial line collapsed like a house of cards. This wasn't just treachery, it was a masterclass in exploiting the human need for reliability in chaos. What made false allies so devastating was their ability to bypass defenses no wall could breach. Spies could be rooted out, but how did you spot a traitor who'd fought beside you for years? The Mongols turned this into an art form, embedding agents within enemy courts who'd spend decades gaining influence before striking. During the siege of Baghdad in 1258, Hulagu Khan's forces were secretly guided by disaffected city officials who'd been promised power, only to be executed alongside their former comrades once the gates fell. Even religion wasn't sacred. Crusader castles in the Holy Land were occasionally surrendered by bribed garrison commanders who'd been convinced their souls would be spared if they cooperated. The decline of this tactic reveals a fascinating shift in military culture. As standing armies replaced mercenary bands, loyalty became less transactional and more institutional. Uniforms, oaths, and standardized pay created systems where betrayal carried consequences beyond the battlefield. By the Napoleonic Wars, the idea of entire units switching sides seemed unthinkable, not because humans grew more honorable, but because armies became machines where individual will was subsumed by discipline. Yet the ghost of false allies lingers in modern insurgencies, where double agents and turned informants play the same deadly game. The difference: today's betrayals are meticulously documented, while medieval ones vanished into the fog of war, leaving us to wonder how many battles were truly decided by steel, and how many by a whispered deal in the darkness. Now prepare for warfare's most unsettling evolution when armies realized the deadliest weapon wasn't a blade or a lie, but something invisible and utterly merciless. Because next, we'll expose how diseases became weapons long before science even understood what germs were. Biological warfare in the medieval world wasn't just brutal, it was eerily sophisticated, proving that sometimes the deadliest soldiers were the ones already dead. Long before germ theory explained how diseases spread, commanders intuitively understood that sickness could be as devastating as any siege engine. The Mongols demonstrated this with horrifying efficiency at the Siege of Kaffa in 1346. When bubonic plague began ravaging their ranks, they didn't retreat. Instead, they loaded corpses onto catapults and launched them over the walls, turning their own misfortune into a weapon. The result, a city choking on pestilence, its defenders dying not from swords but from swollen lymph nodes and raging fevers. Historians now suspect this grotesque tactic didn't just break Kaffa, it may have introduced the Black Death to Europe, sparking a pandemic that wiped out half the continent. But diseased corpses were merely the most infamous tool in this macabre arsenal. Byzantine generals poisoned wells with rotting animals, while Arab armies during the Crusades allegedly left wine barrels tainted with leprosy near enemy camps. The Welsh took a subtler approach, deliberately abandoning cattle infected with anthrax for foraging English troops. What's chilling is how these methods exploited basic human needs: thirst, hunger, even the instinct to loot abandoned supplies. Unlike a sword strike that kills one victim, biological warfare created ripple effects, spreading far beyond the battlefield to civilians and allies alike. At the siege of Thun-el-Averk in 1440, defenders catapulted decomposing horses into attacking camps, unleashing dysentery so severe the besiegers abandoned their own dead in heaps. The decline of these tactics wasn't just due to morality, though the Catholic Church eventually condemned them, but because they were too effective at backfiring. Plague didn't discriminate between friend and foe, and armies that relied on disease often found themselves fleeing their own weapons. By the Renaissance, the rise of professional standing armies made such unpredictable tactics untenable. Yet modern militaries still grapple with their legacy. The Geneva Convention explicitly bans biological weapons, but the specter of their medieval ancestors lingers in every bioterrorism drill and pandemic response plan. Now, shift your gaze from invisible killers to invisible armies, because next, we'll reveal how commanders conjured entire forces from smoke and mirrors, proving that sometimes the most dangerous soldiers were the ones who never existed at all. Shadow armies were the ultimate bluff, a gamble where perception meant more than steel, and the mere illusion of strength could send enemies fleeing without a single arrow being loosed. Commanders like Saladin understood that war wasn't just fought with swords, but with the mind's eye. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, he didn't just defeat the Crusaders, he outthought them before the battle even began. By spacing out tents far beyond his actual troop count and lighting extra campfires at night, he convinced the enemy they faced an overwhelming force. The ruse worked so well that Crusader scouts reported back in panic, their leaders paralyzed by the false certainty of being outnumbered. By the time they realized the deception, it was too late. Saladin's real army had already cut off their water supply, leaving them to wither in the desert sun. But empty tents were just one tool in this psychological arsenal. Mongol commanders would tie branches to their horses' tails, kicking up dust clouds that mimicked the approach of thousands. Byzantine generals deployed straw dummies dressed as archers along city walls, forcing besiegers to waste precious arrows on phantom defenders. Even nature could be co-opted into the charade. During the Reconquista, Spanish forces once herded sheep in precise formations at dusk, their movements from a distance indistinguishable from marching infantry. These weren't just tricks, they were theater productions where the stakes were life and death, and every prop served a purpose. What made these illusions so devastating was their exploitation of human psychology. Fear magnifies what the eye perceives, a lesson the Swiss applied brilliantly during their wars of independence. By having small bands of soldiers march in looping paths through forests, they created the impression of endless reinforcements emerging from the trees. Opponents, already wary of the Swiss reputation for ferocity, often broke ranks rather than face what they believed was an inexhaustible enemy. The same principle applied to naval warfare. Venetian admirals would mount lanterns on fishing boats at night, transforming a handful of vessels into the specter of an entire fleet. The downfall of shadow armies came not from moral outrage but from technology. The invention of telescopes in the 17th century gave commanders their first real tool to pierce the veil of deception. By the 20th century, aerial reconnaissance and satellite imagery rendered these tactics obsolete. Why bother with dummy tanks when a spy satellite could count real ones? Yet modern militaries still pay homage to these ancient ruses in unexpected ways. Inflatable decoy tanks from World War II and electronic warfare that spoofs radar signatures trace their lineage straight back to Saladin's empty tents. The tools have changed, but the lesson remains. In war, what your enemy believes is often more dangerous than what's actually there. Now imagine an even more audacious deception, one that didn't just mimic soldiers, but turned soldiers themselves into something far more unexpected. Because next, we'll see how armies transformed their own men into living bridges, sacrificing mobility for the chance to strike where no enemy expected. Human bridges represent one of warfare's most harrowing innovations, where flesh and bone became temporary infrastructure and survival hinged on sheer collective will. Picture the frozen waters of Lake Peipus during the Battle of the Ice in 1242, where Alexander Nevsky's forces faced the Teutonic Knights. As the ice cracked under the weight of armored cavalry, Russian soldiers did the unthinkable. They locked arms, forming living chains across the fractures, their bodies bridging the gaps so their comrades could advance. This wasn't just desperation, it was a calculated trade of lives for mobility, where the speed of crossing meant the difference between victory and annihilation. The brutality of such tactics reveals a stark truth about medieval warfare. When technology fell short, human bodies filled the gap. Chinese chronicles describe soldiers during the Song dynasty lying in muddy trenches so their backs could serve as walkways for archers. In the Himalayas, Tibetan warriors crossed icy chasms by lashing themselves together with ropes, each man a link in a fragile, breathing bridge. These methods weren't just about physical endurance, they exploited the psychology of unity. An army willing to literally carry its own across rivers signaled an unbreakable cohesion that could demoralize enemies before the fighting even began. Yet what makes human bridges so haunting is their fleeting necessity. By the Renaissance, pontoon bridges and prefabricated timber spans rendered such sacrifices obsolete. The very engineering advances that made warfare more efficient also stripped it of this grim intimacy. Modern militaries would never ask soldiers to become infrastructure, not because they value life more, but because technology now shoulders burdens that once fell to flesh and blood. Still, echoes of this brutal pragmatism linger. Special forces today train to ford rivers under fire, their teamwork a distant cousin of those medieval chains. And in disaster zones, firefighters and rescuers still form human lines to pull survivors from wreckage. The difference, today's bridges are metaphors. But 7 centuries ago, they were literal, and the men who built them knew the ice wouldn't crack twice. Now, shift your gaze from bodies braving water to flames cutting through darkness, because fire's greatest power wasn't just destruction, but the ability to speak across mountains and seas without a single word. Flames leaping into the night sky weren't just warnings, they were medieval text messages, carrying urgent whispers across mountains and seas in minutes. The Byzantines mastered this fiery language with their legendary beacon network, a chain of signal fires stretching 700 miles from the Syrian frontier to Constantinople. Each flickering light was a coded pulse, 1 torch for raiders, 2 for a full-scale invasion, 3 for an existential threat. When the Abbasid Caliphate launched a surprise attack in 778, the capital knew before the enemy's dust cloud was even visible. This wasn't just communication, it was a high-speed game of telephone where every second saved meant lives spared. But the Byzantines weren't alone in harnessing fire's speed. Scottish clans used peat-fueled bonfires to rally against Viking invaders, while the Great Wall of China's beacon towers could relay signals from the Gobi Desert to Beijing in under an hour, a feat unmatched until the telegraph. The genius lay in the simplicity. No complex machinery, just carefully spaced hills and towers staffed by men who trained their whole lives to interpret smoke patterns. Welsh chronicles even describe color-coded flames: green for cavalry, red for infantry, allowing defenders to prepare before the enemy's banners crested the horizon. What made signal fires revolutionary wasn't just their speed, but their resistance to interception. Unlike captured messengers or tapped telegraph wires, a flame's message couldn't be altered mid-transmission. The Mongols learned this the hard way when they tried sabotaging Hungarian beacon chains by lighting decoy fires, only to find locals had backup systems using alternating smoke colors. This redundancy highlights how medieval engineers anticipated problems modern IT teams grapple with today: signal integrity, authentication, and fail-safes. The decline of beacon networks wasn't due to obsolescence but to changing battlefields. As wars moved beyond fixed frontiers, mobile armies needed mobile communication. Yet the legacy of these fiery signals burns brighter than ever. Modern emergency alert systems and even NAS, deep space protocols, owe conceptual debts to those ancient towers where firekeepers kept watch, proving that sometimes the oldest solutions are the hardest to improve upon. Now imagine a deception even more audacious than fake smoke signals, one where the mere illusion of a leader's presence could turn the tide of battle. Because next, we'll see how decoy commanders made kings disappear and reappear like ghosts on the battlefield. Decoy commanders turned warfare into a deadly game of chess where the most powerful piece could vanish and reappear at will. Few moments capture this art of misdirection more dramatically than the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, when Scotland's Robert the Bruce faced a crisis that should have ended his rebellion. Spotting the English knight Henry de Bohun charging toward him in single combat, Bruce didn't just dodge, he split reality itself. While the king fought, an identically armored decoy appeared elsewhere on the battlefield, draped in Bruce's royal surcoat. English archers, convinced they'd spotted their prize, wasted volleys on the impostor while the real Bruce crushed de Bohun's skull with a battle-axe. This wasn't just trickery, it was psychological warfare at its most elegant, proving that sometimes a king's greatest weapon was the illusion of his absence. The brilliance of decoy tactics lay in their exploitation of pre-modern battlefield chaos. Without instant communication or high-powered optics, identifying leaders relied on fleeting glimpses of banners, armor, or distinctive horses. Byzantine emperors capitalized on this by employing shadow emperors, body doubles who rode identical white stallions and wore purple-dyed silk indistinguishable from the real thing. During the Crusades, Richard the Lionheart took it further, sometimes appearing simultaneously at opposite ends of his own camp to keep assassins guessing. These weren't vanity projects, they were calculated defenses against the harsh reality that killing one man could collapse an entire army's morale. A chronicler of the 100 Years' War noted that the sight of a commander's banner falling often triggered mass retreats before anyone confirmed his actual fate. What ultimately doomed this tactic wasn't morality but modernity. The rise of standardized uniforms and chain of command in the 17th century made individual commanders less pivotal and their impersonators less effective. Napoleonic armies moved like clockwork, their leadership structures decentralized enough that losing one general rarely decided battles. Yet the ghost of decoy tactics lingers in modern celebrity culture, where pop stars use body doubles to evade stalkers and politicians employ lookalikes for security. The difference: today's decoys hide from cameras, while medieval ones thrived in plain sight, turning every battlefield into a hall of mirrors where nothing, not even death, was certain. Now consider an illusion even grander than a single disguised king, entire fleets materializing from mist and moonlight, their very existence a carefully crafted lie. Because next, we'll see how navies conquered the seas without ever leaving port. Ghost fleets turned naval warfare into a grand illusion, where the mere suggestion of ships could scatter enemies or lure them into fatal miscalculations. The Venetians, masters of Mediterranean intrigue, staged one of history's most audacious maritime deceptions during their war with Genoa in the 14th century. Facing a numerically superior fleet, they lashed together rafts and old hulls, draping them with sails and hanging lanterns from their rigging. From a distance in the twilight, this flotilla of decoys appeared as a formidable armada, convincing the Genoese admiral to abandon his planned attack and retreat to port. The ruse cost Venice nothing but some scrap wood and candle wax, yet it bought them weeks to reinforce their defenses and rally allies. But the Venetians weren't alone in this watery sleight of hand. Chinese annals describe Admiral Zheng, his expeditions using bamboo frames wrapped in painted cloth to mimic warships, while Norse sagas tell of longships rigged with extra oars to exaggerate their crew numbers. The brilliance of these illusions lay in their psychological precision. Naval commanders, often operating with limited visibility and unreliable intelligence, relied heavily on silhouette and movement to gauge threats. A few well-placed lanterns bobbing on the waves at night could suggest an entire squadron lying in wait. During the Anglo-Spanish conflicts, English privateers reportedly towed clusters of small boats behind their ships to create the illusion of a larger fleet, a tactic that repeatedly tricked Spanish lookouts into overestimating their enemy's strength. What ultimately sank ghost fleets wasn't enemy cannons but technology. The invention of radar in the 20th century made wooden mock-ups laughably obsolete. No amount of clever paint could fool radio waves. Yet the underlying principle of strategic deception lives on in modern electronic warfare, where navies use radar jammers and holographic projections to spoof enemy sensors. The tools have evolved, but the game remains the same. Make your enemy see what isn't there and hide what is. Now, imagine a spy network so seamless it left no paper trail, where secrets traveled not on parchment but through whispers and coded gestures. Because next, we'll uncover how medieval espionage thrived in the space between spoken words. Whisper networks turned espionage into an art of invisible ink, where the most sensitive intelligence traveled not on parchment, but through hushed conversations and memorized rhymes. The Byzantines perfected this shadowy craft with their logothetes, elite messengers who carried state secrets not in satchels, but in their minds. Trained since childhood in memory palaces and cipher songs, these human hard drives could recite entire treaties verbatim after a single hearing, leaving no physical trace for enemy agents to intercept. When Emperor Justinian needed to coordinate with his frontier generals in 642, he didn't send scrolls that could be stolen. He dispatched a blind monk whose disability made him seem harmless, yet whose memory held battle plans precise down to the last arrow stockpile. The genius of oral intelligence lay in its deniability. A captured messenger with written orders was a smoking gun, but a peasant gossiping about crop prices might actually be relaying troop movements through prearranged code words. Persian spies in the Sassanid Empire took this further, embedding agents as traveling minstrels whose epic poems contained hidden troop counts based on syllable patterns. Even monasteries became hubs for this sound-based espionage. Benedictine monks across Europe used Gregorian chants to transmit alerts about Viking raids, altering melodies to indicate attack directions. These weren't just tricks, they were cryptographic systems written on air, vanishing the moment they were heard. What destroyed whisper networks wasn't enemy ingenuity but the rise of bureaucracy. As kingdoms centralized, written records became essential for accountability and vulnerabilities. The Arab conquest of Byzantine territories in the 7th century revealed this painfully when captured document caches exposed entire spy rings. Yet modern intelligence agencies still grapple with these ancient lessons. The Cold War saw KGB handlers using nursery rhymes to cue sleeper agents, while the French resistance in World War II relayed D-Day plans through seemingly innocuous radio broadcasts of poetry. The medium changes, but the principle endures. The safest secret is one that leaves no trail. Now consider a weapon even more ephemeral than Whisper's rhythms, and chants so hypnotic they could drain an enemy's will to fight before the first blade was drawn. Because next, we'll see how medieval armies wielded sound not to communicate but to paralyze. Trance tactics turned battlefields into psychological laboratories where rhythm and repetition became weapons as sharp as any blade. While the Aztecs famously used hypnotic drum patterns and wave after wave of identical attacks to drain their enemies' will to fight, medieval commanders employed subtler but equally potent methods to erode focus and morale. Picture the scene at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where Polish and Lithuanian forces unleashed a cacophony of clanging metal and guttural chants moments before their charge. This wasn't just noise, it was a calculated assault on the senses, designed to overload the Teutonic Knights' mental defenses before physical combat even began. The science behind these methods is startlingly modern. Studies now show that repetitive stimuli, whether drum beats, chants, or even the metronomic clash of weapons, can induce a trance-like state where reaction times slow and decision-making falters. Byzantine manuals describe soldiers trained to march in sync with specific cadences that subtly disoriented opponents, while Norse berserkers used rhythmic breathing to enter frenzied states their enemies mistook for supernatural possession. Even the colors and patterns on shields were sometimes chosen not for heraldry, but for their dizzying optical effects when spun or flashed in sunlight. What's fascinating is how these tactics exploited universal human vulnerabilities. Just as modern shoppers are subconsciously swayed by store music, medieval warriors found themselves swaying to an enemy's rhythm without realizing it. The Swiss Confederacy's use of alpine horns before charges wasn't just communication, it created a wall of sound that triggered primal fight or flight responses. And during the Reconquista, Moorish armies employed ululating battle cries that studies suggest can trigger anxiety at specific frequencies. The decline of trance tactics mirrors warfare's shift from psychological artistry to mechanical precision. Gunpowder's roar drowned out subtle auditory manipulation, and standardized drill commands prioritized order over mind games. Yet modern militaries still harness these principles in drills designed to induce muscle memory, while sports psychologists use rhythmic cues to optimize athlete performance. The Aztecs might not have understood neural entrainment, but their war drums proved one timeless truth. The most vulnerable part of any army isn't its body, but the minds that guide it. Now imagine a fortress that wasn't just defended but designed to collapse the moment attackers trusted it. because next we'll see how trap forts turned arrogance into annihilation. Trap forts turned medieval strongholds into deadly puzzles where the safest-looking buildings were often the most lethal. Imagine riding victorious through the gates of what seems like an abandoned castle, only to hear the ominous crack of supporting beams giving way, too late to escape the tons of masonry rigged to collapse onto invaders. The Mongols elevated this grim art during their conquest of Khwarezmia in 1220, deliberately leaving towns seemingly undefended to lure pursuing forces into kill zones. As enemy soldiers fanned out to loot empty houses, hidden ropes were cut, sending pre-weakened ceilings crashing down while Mongol archers materialized on the surrounding hills. This wasn't just sabotage, it was architectural warfare where every beam and stairwell became a potential weapon. What made these deceptions so devastating was their exploitation of human predictability. Victorious armies expected to occupy intact structures, not question why a fortress's gates swung open without resistance. Byzantine engineers took this further by booby-trapping their own border forts. False grain stores hid incendiary mixtures that ignited when disturbed, while treasure rooms were built over concealed pits of quicklime. At the siege of Château-Gaillard in 1204, French attackers learned this the hard way when an apparently abandoned tower collapsed mid-occupation, crushing dozens while the real defenders watched safely from hidden tunnels. The decline of trap forts reveals a fascinating shift in military priorities. As siege artillery grew more powerful in the 15th century, commanders focused on building stronger walls rather than clever deceptions. But the deeper reason was psychological. The rise of professional armies made soldiers less likely to recklessly disperse for looting, robbing trap forts of their prey. Modern militaries still study these tactics, though urban warfare training includes checking for structural sabotage, proving that even 800 years later, the ghosts of those Mongol-engineered collapses still whisper warnings. Now picture an illusion even more dazzling than a rigged fortress, entire armies multiplied not by recruits but by reflections, because next we'll see how polished metal and clever angles could turn 100 soldiers into 1,000. Mirror tactics turned sunlight and water into weapons of mass illusion, bending reality itself to make armies appear where none existed. At the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, the Norse defenders demonstrated this eerie art by arranging their polished shields at precise angles along the riverbank. As the English forces advanced, the morning sun struck the metal surfaces, creating blinding flashes that mimicked the movement of countless additional warriors. The effect was so convincing that King Harold's scouts initially reported an enemy force twice its actual size, a miscalculation that nearly cost them the battle before the first axe was swung. This wasn't just clever positioning, it was physics weaponized, where every glint of light became a phantom soldier. The science behind these illusions reveals a deep understanding of human perception. Medieval commanders knew that fear magnifies what the eye perceives, a lesson the Byzantines applied by lining their walls with brass plaques that reflected sunlight in pulsating waves, making garrisons appear to shimmer like an endless host. Water played an equally deceptive role. Arab armies in the deserts of Al-Andalus would position troops along wadis at dawn, their reflections in shallow pools creating the illusion of doubled ranks. The key lay in movement. The way ripples made reflected figures seem to shift independently, tricking observers into seeing reinforcements materializing from the earth itself. What ultimately ended mirror tactics wasn't superior strategy but advancing optics. By the Renaissance, the widespread use of early telescopes allowed commanders to pierce these illusions, spotting the telltale uniformity of reflected images. Yet the psychological principles they exploited remain relevant today. modern militaries use inflatable decoys and holographic projections to mislead enemy drones, proving that even in an age of satellites, war still hinges on making opponents see what isn't there. Now imagine an army that didn't just manipulate light but sound itself, moving across the landscape with the silence of falling snow. Because next, we'll see how removing every footfall and clink of armor could transform the battlefield into a stage for invisible attackers. Silent marches transformed warfare into a shadow game where victory went not to the loudest army, but to the one that could move like ghosts through the night. The Swiss Confederacy demonstrated this with chilling precision at the Battle of Morgarten in 1315. Knowing their outnumbered militia stood no chance against Austrian knights in open combat, they stripped away anything that might betray their presence, removing clanking armor, wrapping hooves in cloth, even holding their breath as enemy scouts passed mere feet away. When the moment came, they erupted from the forest in total silence, their attack so sudden the armored knights barely had time to raise lances before being dragged from saddles and butchered in the mud. This wasn't just ambush tactics, it was sensory warfare where the absence of sound became as deadly as any blade. What made these silent approaches so revolutionary was their inversion of medieval battlefield psychology. Knights relied on the thunder of hooves and the clatter of plate armor to intimidate foes. The Swiss proved that silence could be far more terrifying. Their techniques spread like wildfire through Europe. Hungarian raiders learned to ford rivers at night with rags stuffed between chainmail links, while Japanese ninja developed special straw sandals that left no footprints. Even horses were retrained. Mongol mounts would freeze mid-gallop at a whispered command, turning entire cavalry units into motionless statues hidden in plain sight. The true genius lay in the details. Soldiers greased leather straps to prevent squeaking, wrapped sword scabbards in felt, and timed movements to coincide with natural sounds like rustling leaves or distant thunder. At the Siege of Neuss in 1475, Burgundian forces allegedly detected an approaching relief army not by scouts, but because birds suddenly stopped singing, proof that true stealth extended beyond human senses. These weren't crude tricks, they were early examples of what modern special forces call noise discipline, a science of movement where every footfall was calculated. Ironically, the standardization of silent marching in professional armies led to its origins being forgotten. By the Napoleonic Wars, noise control was simply part of drill manuals, no longer the battle-winning secret it once was. Yet modern militaries still train soldiers to move like those Swiss rebels at Morgarten, proving that some skills never lose their edge, no matter how much technology advances. Now imagine an even darker twist on deception, not just hiding your movements, but staging injuries so convincing they lured enemies into fatal mistakes. Because next, we'll see how the theater of war extended to fake wounds, where blood-curdling screams became invitations to ambush. Wounded soldiers sprawled across the battlefield weren't always what they seemed sometimes. Their agonized moans were the opening act of an elaborate trap. The Saxons at Hastings in 1066 turned this gruesome theater into high art. As Norman cavalry charged their shield wall, a group of Saxon fighters suddenly collapsed, clutching at imaginary wounds. Overconfident Norman knights broke formation to finish off the injured, only to find themselves swarmed by the very men they thought they'd slain. This wasn't just deception, it was psychological judo, weaponizing an enemy's instinct to press their advantage into a fatal mistake. The brilliance of the wounded Rus lay in its exploitation of battlefield empathy, or rather the lack of it. Medieval warriors expected adversaries to fight or flee, not writhe in staged agony. Byzantine manuals advised soldiers to smear themselves with animal blood and practice realistic convulsions. while Mongol scouts would feign arrow wounds to lure pursuers into narrow ravines. The act had to be convincing enough to trigger an opponent's predatory instincts, yet controlled enough to allow sudden counterattacks. At the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, rebel forces pretended to retreat in disarray, leaving dying comrades whose sudden revival sealed the royalist army's fate. What ultimately ended this tactic wasn't battlefield effectiveness but evolving notions of honor. By the Renaissance, the rise of chivalric codes and professional medical corps made feigning injuries taboo. Wounded men were now to be cared for, not exploited. The Geneva Convention later codified this shift, branding such deceptions as war crimes. Yet the legacy of these ruses lingers in modern combat training, where soldiers learn that even a corpse might be a landmine's trigger. Now imagine a weapon that didn't just fool the eyes but convinced enemies they were fighting something supernatural. Because next, we'll see how blades could scream, hiss, and whisper, turning fear itself into a battlefield advantage. Animated arms turned the battlefield into a theater of the supernatural, where weapons didn't just wound bodies, they shattered sanity. The Maori warriors of New Zealand perfected this psychological terror with their potu clubs, carved with hollow chambers that produced an unearthly hiss when swung through the air. To enemies unfamiliar with the craftsmanship behind these sounds, it seemed as though the very weapons were alive, possessed by vengeful spirits hungry for souls. This wasn't mere ornamentation. It was acoustic warfare designed to trigger the most primal human fear, the dread of forces beyond understanding. Other cultures weaponized sound with equal ingenuity. Tibetan monks forged swords with carefully placed slots that whistled like screaming ghosts in mid-swing, while Aztec macuahuitl clubs embedded with obsidian shards created a bone-chilling screech upon impact. The psychological effect was profound. Soldiers who could stand firm against steel often broke when faced with what they believed was demonic intervention. Historical accounts from the Crusades describe Saracen forces employing curved blades that emitted eerie wails, causing some European knights to drop their weapons and flee before combat even began. These weren't just tools of war, they were instruments of mass hallucination. What makes these weapons so fascinating is their intersection of art and terror. Craftsmen spent lifetimes perfecting the acoustics of a single blade, tuning it like a musical instrument to produce sounds that unsettled rather than soothed. The Japanese takai swords carried by some samurai contained concealed compartments that rattled ominously when drawn, mimicking the warning hiss of a serpent. In West Africa, certain tribes attached hollowed gourds to spear shafts that moaned like tormented spirits when thrust through the air. Each culture developed its own sonic signature, but the goal remained universal: to convince enemies they weren't fighting men, but something far more terrifying. The disappearance of these psychological masterpieces traces back to the Enlightenment's rise. As warfare became more civilized and rationalism took hold, weapons designed to deceive the senses were dismissed as primitive theatrics. European colonial powers, armed with standardized muskets and bayonets, saw no value in weapons that prioritized psychological impact over mechanical efficiency. Yet something vital was lost in this shift: the understanding that combat has always been as much about perception as physical force. Modern militaries have spent decades rediscovering these principles through non-lethal acoustic weapons and disinformation campaigns, proving that the line between ancient terror tactics and modern psychological operations is thinner than we might think. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is how few of these sonic weapons survive today. Museums display their silent forms, but the chilling sounds they once produced live only in scattered oral histories. The Maori potu no longer hiss in battle. The Tibetan ghost swords no longer wail, their voices silenced not by obsolescence, but by a world that forgot how powerfully sound shapes fear. In an age of drone strikes and cyber warfare, we might do well to remember that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the one that cuts deepest, but the one that haunts longest after the battle ends. These forgotten tactics are more than just historical curiosities. They're a testament to human ingenuity under the most extreme pressure. What's striking isn't just how effective these strategies were, but how completely they vanished from mainstream military thought. Some were erased by victors who didn't want their enemies learning from them. Others faded as warfare became more standardized, trading creativity for predictability. The Mongols didn't just defeat armies, they rewrote the rules of engagement, only for those innovations to be buried under centuries of Eurocentric military doctrine. The Byzantines turned deception into a science, yet their manuals gathered dust while blunt force strategies took center stage. But here's the twist: many of these tactics are quietly resurfacing in modern conflicts. The feigned retreat lives on in guerrilla warfare, where insurgents lure conventional forces into urban kill zones. Terrain manipulation has evolved into environmental warfare, with militaries studying how floods or wildfires can be weaponized. Even the Parthian shot has a digital age counterpart in drone swarms that strike while appearing to withdraw. The parallels are uncanny, proving that while technology changes, the psychology of conflict remains timeless. What's truly lost isn't just the tactics themselves, but the mindset that created them: a willingness to see every element of the world as a potential weapon. Medieval commanders viewed fog, animal behavior, even the sound of their own voices as tools. Today's militaries, for all their advanced tech, often lack that holistic creativity. There's a lesson here for more than just soldiers. Entrepreneurs, artists, and problem solvers of all kinds can learn from this era when limitations sparked brilliance rather than stifling it. So why does this matter now? Because history isn't just about the past, it's a toolbox for the future. The next time you face an obstacle, ask yourself, what would a medieval general do? Maybe the answer isn't to charge head-on, but to feign retreat, to weaponize the terrain, or to let the enemy's assumptions become their downfall. After all, the greatest victories often go to those who fight smarter, not harder. Which of these tactics resonated most with you? Let's keep the conversation going, because the best ideas are the ones we share. Until next time, stay curious and remember, sometimes the oldest tricks are the ones that still work best.